Spiking is a serious matter and people who do it should be caught and punished. But I do want to issue a note of caution because I'm slightly worried about this Amendment 292R put forward by Lord Faulkner. I'm worried it might be too reactive and responding to the perception that this is a major problem rather than a kind of cool factual analysis. I just think that calling for an urgent review could unintentionally fuel what I think might be a moral panic and create a climate of fear. To give some context, despite the headlines and social media hysteria, some careful commentators and a range of experts have raised doubts, querying some of the sensationalist coverage and warning against overreacting. There was a useful article in Vice that started the debunking, and it quoted Guy Jones, a senior scientist at drugs charity Loop, who pointed out that few drugs would be able to be injected like this using a needle. Administering drugs in this way is just not an easy task. And some experts have explained that it would be particularly difficult if using date rape drugs because of the large needle that would be needed, and that the needle would need to be in the body for 20 seconds at least. The Director of Global Drug Survey, Adam Winstock, notes that there are very few widely accessible drugs that could be used this way and given intramuscularity in small enough volume that people wouldn't notice. And a critical care nurse that I saw interviewed suggested that the likelihood of administering drugs like ketamine was virtually zero. And after a high-profile report about somebody being injected by HIV, the National AIDS Trust pointed out that getting AIDS from a needle injury is extremely rare and diagnosis takes weeks. So I think it's just worth pausing. It is true that while the police have accumulated lots of reports, there are very few instances where there are injuries that would be consistent with a needle. Yet, despite these contradictions and the lack of evidence and some doubts about the feasibility of injection spiking, all sorts of institutions, such as universities and political organisations, have accepted these stories at face value, and I think then have themselves ended up sending out scare messages. So when a story goes viral on social media, students find themselves deluged with official email warnings about unacceptable, reprehensible and life-threatening practices if they go out for the night to a nightclub. And I just am concerned that those in positions of authority risk frightening young women and demonising the same generation of young men with no evidence of a wide-scale problem. There's a petition going around at the moment that's been officially sanctioned by all sorts of people that nightclubs should be legally required to thoroughly search guests, which is no small matter. And I think it's worrying how many are so fearful that they would endorse full body searches for a night out. And I noted that students at the University of Bristol have set up a group called Girls' Night In, which urges young women to stay indoors until the clubs change their ways. In other words, my lords, fear can be a serious barrier to women's freedom. And I just want to avoid ratcheting up threats and undermining women's confidence about fully participating in public life. And as legislators, I think we need to encourage a sense of perspective and at least consider that anything we do does not fuel what might be a moral panic. I know the review asks for looking at the facts, but the fact that you'd have an urgent review might actually make things worse. And then just one, if I could ask a particular query that I've got on amendment to Lord Faulkner on Amendment 284, where the stress is that conduct includes speech. And obviously, as somebody who's always concerned about free speech matters, how would he envisage that people would not ultimately be criminalised and penalised for things they're saying? How does he balance that up with the need to protect people's freedom of speech?
In relation to the Baroness Fox, who is there, yes, I take note of what she says in relation to the review in relation to spiking. One is in a bit of a dilemma. There is already some degree of anxiety in relation to spiking. Should one, I think what Baroness Fox was saying is don't have an immediate review because that increases the anxiety, but if you do nothing about it, the anxiety continues. I note which says my own judgment would be that one should have the review. Separately, she raised the question of, is one worried that if one is criminalising through harassment conduct, including speech, that criminalises free speech? I don't think so, because the sorts of speech that we would intend to criminalise under the harassment crime would be cajoling, offensive behaviour, not expressing an opinion, but insulting people, demanding sex or other things of people in a wholly inappropriate way. And I don't think that would give rise to the risk of an attack on free speech.
I suppose it's following on from what the noble Lord Marx pointed out about the broadness of that amendment. I mean, since 2016, I've been subjected to a fair amount of verbal, as they would say, anywhere walking around the Westminster Village from people who didn't approve of my Brexit views, and it wasn't pleasant, it wasn't sexual, but it was particularly obnoxious and offensive. It's just that I don't know that that should be against the law. I might have a moral view of it. I wouldn't want them all to be arrested. And so, and what I'm saying is that verbal harassment is unpleasant, but it's a question of whether it's criminal. And that's why that broadened sense. I just don't want everyone being locked up for things they say, even if what they say causes distress.
I completely take your point, and the law has been very, very aware of that. There's a difference between people saying to you in the street, putting it on one side, I very much disagree with your views on Brexit, and on others saying, why are you such a stupid, awful, and then a series of expletives, and chasing you down the street, just abusing you. And the law is capable of making the distinction.
Rather than the former, I have to say.
Well, there might come a point where that becomes harassment. In relation